WIN Brown Eye Exercise.
A sniper's bullet cut down Dr. King as he stood on a hotel balcony in Memphis.
Officers also reportedly chased and fired on a radio-equipped car containing 2 white men.
April 4th, 1968. Jane Elliott, a third-grade elementary school teacher, was preparing the items for the lesson she had planned for her students for February's Hero of the Month project. The assassination of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King came up in the news, and she vividly remembers a white reporter placing his microphone in front of a local black leader and asked the question, "When our leader was killed several years ago, his widow held us together. Who's going to control your people?" The news of Dr. King's death both shocked and disgusted her, that she threw out the lesson plan for the next day and came up with a new one that would allow the students to experience prejudice and discrimination firsthand. The first student to arrive on the day of the experiment greeted Mrs. Elliott as he settled on his desk. He asked, "They shot that king yesterday. Why did they shot that king?" As the rest of the students arrived, Elliott asked the rest of the class how it feels to be a black boy or girl. It would be hard to know, wouldn't it, unless we actually experience discrimination ourselves. Would you like to find out? She said. And with a unanimous yeah, the kids agreed. To demonstrate to the youngsters what racial segregation would be like, she decided to base the activity on eye color rather than skin color. Elliott had all the blue-eyed youngsters line up on one side of the room in what is now known as the Blue Eyes, Brown Eyes exercise. She taught the youngsters that blue-eyed children were inferior to brown-eyed or green-eyed children. Elliott pulled out green construction paper armbands and asked each of the blue-eyed kids to wear one. "The brown-eyed people are the better people in this room," Elliott began. "They are cleaner and they are smarter." To combat the initial opposition met by the minority of the students of the idea that the brown-eyed children were better than the blue-eyed children, Elliott had prepared a deception. Eye color, hair color, and skin color are caused by a chemical, and went on writing melanin on the blackboard. Elliott deceived the youngsters by claiming that melanin was linked to their better intelligence and learning ability. She told them that because those with brown eyes were better, smarter, and superior to those with blue eyes, they were entitled to extra recess time and access to the water fountain. At this point, she could feel a chasm forming between the two groups of students. Blue-eyed people sit around and do nothing. You give them something nice and they just wreck it. Do blue-eyed people remember what they've been taught? Elliott asked. No, replied the brown-eyed kids. I watched wonderful, thoughtful children turn into nasty, vicious, discriminating little third graders. Brown-eyed kids picked on blue-eyed ones and banded together against them. The kids began to make up their own explanations as to what makes them superior. To further alienate the blue-eyed kids, Elliott told them that they would have to drink from paper cups. Why? One girl asked. Because we might catch something. A brown-eyed student expressed their concern. Mrs. Elliott agreed by nodding to further insight their differences. As if this wasn't concerning enough, one of the brown-eyed students asked Mrs. Elliott herself, Hey, Mrs. Elliott, how come you're the teacher if you've got blue eyes? And before Mrs. Elliott replied, another boy said, if she didn't have blue eyes, she would be the principal or the superintendent. The changes went beyond the walls of the classroom as the students with blue eyes lost what they had learned the day before. Shy brown-eyed children became extroverted and bossy. They improved their grades on simple examinations, and they accomplished mathematical and reading skills that had previously seemed beyond their capabilities. The inferior peers changed as well, becoming scared and submissive children who performed worse on tests and even withdrew themselves during recess, including those who had previously been dominant in the class. A bright blue-eyed girl who had never struggled with multiplication tables before began making errors, and three brown-eyed girls ganged up on her during recess. You best apologize to us for getting in our way since we're better than you. They continued to harass her until she apologized. Elliot switched the roles the next day. The brown-eyed students were inferior while the blue-eyed students were superior by telling them how shifty, dumb, and lazy they were, while the blue-eyed children taunted the brown-eyed youngsters in similar ways to the day before. Elliot claims it was considerably less harsh. Perhaps the blue-eyed students had already felt the devastation of being isolated that they didn't want to inflict a similar pain once the roles were reversed. As the second day comes to a close, Elliot ended the exercise. Elliot had to remind them that the experiment was conducted for the students to understand King's assassination. After learning that it was all an experiment, the children hugged each other and cried, feeling remorseful of how much hate was conjured because of what a small, insignificant difference can create. She invited the kids to write down what they had learned as a way to reflect on the experience. The study was so effective that the most typical remark by the students sounded like this. The people in Mrs. Elliott's room who had brown eyes got to discriminate against the people who had blue eyes. I have brown eyes. I felt like hitting them if I wanted to. I got to have 5 minutes extra of recess. The next day, when the tables were turned, I felt like quitting school. I felt mad. That's what it feels like when you're discriminated against. Elliot was satisfied that she managed to help her students understand the demoralizing effect of bigotry. Many parents, upon receiving the essays, seemed to approve of the exercise. Elliot shared the essays with her mother, and they agreed to show it to the editor of the Weekly Riceville Recorder. On April 18, 1968, on page 4, the children's experience was printed under the headline, How Discrimination Feels. From there, Elliot's study snowballed and was picked up by the Associated Press, and about a month later, she was invited to appear on The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson. Hundreds of calls rushed into the show's telephone switchboard after she spoke about her study in a brief interview section. The majority of the calls were negative, which said, "How dare you try this cruel experiment on white children? Black children grew up accustomed to such behavior. But white children? There's no way they could possibly understand it. It's cruel to white children and will cause them great psychological damage." In which Elliot replied, "Why are we so worried about the fragile egos of white children who experience a couple of hours of made-up racism one day, when blacks experience real racism every day of their lives?" Mrs. Elliot has repeated the exercise for decades around the country, and in 1922, she was even featured on the Oprah Winfrey Show, successfully replicating her original study in a different setting by only differentiating them by the color of their eyes. Elliot is now in her 80s, and she still conducts the exercises herself. Elliot went on to become a diversity educator and activist throughout the years, and conducted the tests with adults all across the world.